In this episode, I'm joined by Jay Garfield, who is an American professor of philosophy who specializes in Tibetan Buddhism. In this episode, we loosely discuss his book, Engaging Buddhism, Why Does Buddhism Matter to Philosophy, alongside discussions on what is meant by Western philosophy and the hegemony of Western philosophical modes of study. I'd like to say a big thank you to my paid patrons and subscribers for making all of this work possible. And if you would like to support the podcast, because it's very much appreciated, then please find links in the description below. Enjoy. So, Jay Garfield, thanks very much for joining us on Hermitix podcast.
A pleasure. Thanks for having me.
We are going to be discussing your book, Engaging Buddhism, Why Does Buddhism Matter to Philosophy, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2015. But alongside that, I imagine we will dip into what the Wikipedia on you says was a bit of a controversy. Mm-hmm. The sort of hegemony of what is defined as quote unquote philosophy as by those predominantly in Western academia. What do we mean when we say philosophy? We mean a very constrained, very, very constrained thing. But I'm sure we'll get to that. But before we do get to that, just tell us a little bit about yourself and how this book came about.
Well, a bit about myself. I teach philosophy. It's what I've done all my life. I teach at Smith College and the Harvard Divinity School predominantly, but also hang out at a few other places. And like many people of my generation, almost all people of my generation, when I studied philosophy, I finished my education not even knowing that there was such a thing as non-Western philosophy. And when I learned that there was, and that there's quite a lot of fascinating philosophy being done by people who don't look like me, and who never did, I began to be quite disturbed by the intellectual parochialism of the philosophical world. And by that, I don't just mean the European philosophical world, because even, especially until very recently, even in Asia, Africa, other places, when people were studying philosophy, what they meant by that was European philosophy. And so I've devoted a lot of my energy over the last few decades to trying to globalize philosophy, pressuring organizations to globalize, pressuring departments to globalize, and in my own practice, trying to be as eclectic as I possibly can in the sources on which I draw and in the teaching that I do. So that's a little bit about me. Okay.
I mean, that word globalize is an interesting one because there's almost, I would argue, there's actually a Western conception of what globalization is.
Yeah. There's globalization and there's globalizing. And by globalizing, I don't mean participating in the project of consumer surveillance capitalism globalization. That's not what I mean. What I mean is expanding our vision to go beyond the Greco-European tradition, to look at philosophy all across the globe, and to think about the history of philosophy, not in terms of one tradition or even a set of siloed traditions, but in terms of the interaction between traditions, and to think about the interactions that we can facilitate in our own time to really allow the future of philosophy to be more exciting than its past.
Okay. Well, I very much look forward to your answer then before we jump in with the book and the hegemony of philosophy. The Hermitix question, you can place three thinkers, living or dead, into a room and listen in on the conversation. Who do you pick?
Gosh, that would be fun, wouldn't it?
They can all miraculously speak the same language.
Of course, yeah, that would be important. But that's the great thing about philosophers; they all miraculously speak English. Right? So who would I put in that room? I would probably just go with a bunch of my favorites. I would certainly, my first selection will be Chandrakirti, who was a 7th century Indian Buddhist philosopher, whose work I really enjoy and whose spirit in doing philosophy I really enjoy. I would put David Hume in that room, from the Western tradition, from the modern Western tradition. Despite worries about Hume himself, I think philosophically he's quite fascinating. And the third one, that's the interesting one. It would be Zhuangzi, for sure. And so what you would get there are three seriously iconoclastic, skeptical philosophers, each of whom is really interested in the way that philosophical thinking fits into a human life and the way in which our knowledge and our understanding of the world is grounded in our forms of life and our practices. So those would probably be my three. If I could get a fourth, I'd throw Wittgenstein in there.
well, yeah, adding Wittgenstein to any room sort of changes the dynamic completely. But one thing I'm interested in, I mean, the discussion, of course, would put most philosophers in a room. The discussion is really interesting. But how do you think Hume would be with these two other figures who are, contextually completely removed?
Yeah. One thing, of course, is we know that Hume was a pretty good socializer. He was a good party guy. So, but of course, he was also a racist. So he might have a little bit of an issue there, but I'm hoping he'd get over it fast. I think that because of Hume's grounding in the Greek skeptical tradition, and because of Hume's enormous insight into the role of custom in our lives, that Hume would be remarkably at home with both Chandrakirti and with Zhuangzi. And I think that would be kind of fun.
Is there any sort of answers, or perhaps not conclusions would be the wrong word, but yeah, answers that you yourself would like to come from this discussion?
No, I'd be upset if there were answers. I would hope there would be questions, cool arguments, disputes, and puzzles, and a kind of deeper appreciation of the way in which the way that we lead our lives determines our norms, our values, the nature of knowledge, the nature of morality, and the way in which all of that feeds back into the way we think philosophically.
Mm-hmm. So why Wittgenstein as a fourth?
Oh, because Wittgenstein is the 20th century philosopher who's thought most deeply about those particular issues, and who's, I think, the natural heir to Sextus and Hume in the West. But, there's this gigantic and fascinating literature on Wittgenstein and Buddhism. And a lot of that links ideas that Wittgenstein develops in the second part of his life, in the investigations, with ideas that Chandrakirti develops. Mm-hmm. So there's a great old paper that nobody reads anymore, but they should, by Bob Thurman from the 1970s or early 80s, called Chandrakirti and Wittgenstein, Philosophical Non-Egocentricity, Chandrakirti and Wittgenstein. And it's a fabulous paper, and it really puts Chandrakirti and Wittgenstein into dialogue in a very productive way.
Okay. I do have one other question there, because I'm always interested, as someone who is specifically trained in continental philosophy. Mm-hmm. My studies begin from Kant onwards, and I see Kant as, Hume, Kant. I just see Kant as, he answered a lot of questions there. Are you sympathetic? So I'm always interested why people might pick Hume and have not made that. I'm not going to say leap as if it's a definite thing you would do, but haven't accepted Kant's continuation.
Okay, let's think about that one for a minute. And I'm tempted to say, hey, read my Hume book, where I really talk about why we don't want to think about Hume as Kant's whipping boy, and we might want to think that, in fact, Kant got things wrong that Hume got right. Mm-hmm. So I was trained that way too for a long time. To think of all of pre-Kantian philosophy as what we did until Kant came along, and now we can, and that Kant kind of opens up the field for philosophy as we know it today. I just came to think that that's really wrong. Mm-hmm. And a lot of that is because when you think about the biggest difference between Hume and Kant, mm-hmm. temperamentally and philosophically, it's the difference between naturalism and transcendentalism. Mm-hmm. And when we move from Hume to Kant, we forego a naturalist approach to philosophy, thinking about knowledge in terms of our actual epistemic practices, thinking about ethics in terms of our affective responses to one another, to thinking about knowledge as something that's constrained by transcendent principles deriving from pure reason, and that not that morality comes to us from some other domain. Look, another way to think about this is that Hume is somebody who has rejected the religious foundation of philosophy, and Kant's brought Lutheranism back into the picture, Now, I'm a kind of committed naturalist, as with Zhuangzi, as with Chandrakirti, as with Hume. I kind of think that when we're thinking about knowledge, what we need to do is ask, how do we use that term, and what are our epistemic practices? When we think about morality, how do our moral judgments, moral practices, moral intuitions fit into the lives that we actually lead? That was Hume's idea. And Kant thought that couldn't possibly work. And I think that if that can't work, nothing can work. So when I read Kant on causality in the second analogy, or in the transcendental deduction, and I read Hume on causality, and I ask who gets this one right, for me, it's just a slam dunk for Hume. When I look at Hume on personal identity and Kant telling me that what I really am is a transcendental ego outside of space and time, I just think, who besides a philosopher could ever believe that what I really am is a non-spatio-temporal transcendental entity, instead of a kind of natural continuum of causal processes? So I just think that you put these two together, and the unwinding of Hume's project by Kant just sets philosophy back in a terrible way. So give me Hume over Kant any day.
Okay.
Now, that's not to say that Kant gets everything wrong and that Hume gets everything right, by the way. And here's the big event. So I should now do the other side of that. Here's what Kant gets seriously right and what Hume gets seriously wrong. That you can't develop an account of mind in the natural world without a theory of cognitive activity and processing, and without thinking about what the mind brings to the world, as opposed to thinking that the mind is just this passive thing that associates ideas. Right? Hume didn't understand what the mind was. And Kant understood that we've got to think about it in terms of cognitive processing. So the way I see Kant is he opens the field not for epistemology and ethics. He opens the field for cognitive science. Now, having said that, I would also say that it was Hume who first saw that psychology and philosophy had to work together. And what Kant did was to really show how that could happen, even though he thought he was showing the opposite. And so I think that Kant's brilliant contribution is to understand and to really teach us all that the activity of synthesis and the construction of a world in which we live is absolutely central to what the mind does. And that is a big advance over Hume. But you've got to be able to do that in a naturalistic way. And that Kant doesn't do. And Hume saw that was absolutely necessary.
Okay. Well, that's years of postgraduate study gone. Well, because I guess this might come up later in this discussion of what Western philosophy is, but I think Kant is one of those figures, as you sort of say, that it's pre-Kant, post-Kant, and him as a figure is almost this cornerstone of the legitimization of Western philosophy, as if you could begin from him and ignore everything else. But that itself is a question which really comes from a bigger question, which is, I think, just an ongoing huge question in philosophy. And your book tackles it sort of underneath throughout, as it would, because it's Buddhism in relation to Western philosophy to an extent, which is, what do you make of the East-West divide? Do you think that's even a thing?
No, I don't think it is, for a whole lot of reasons. I mean, one is you've got to figure out where to draw it. So Anthony Flew famously decided that it was the Suez Canal, which is a wonderfully British imperialist way of thinking about it. But that's crazy. We know that historically there was so much interaction between India, Persia, the Middle East, Greece, and that distinction might make sense in an imperial context. It doesn't make sense of the history of philosophy at all. Roger Ames always said that, no, you don't want to draw it at the Tigris and the Euphrates. He was being a little bit more generous than Flew, but it's actually the Himalayas. You've got to think of South Asia and Persia and the Middle East as part of the West, but that China was doing something completely different. Mm-hmm. There is something to that because there was far less exchange of texts and ideas between China and Europe than there was between India, Persia, and Europe historically. But there was a lot of interaction between China and India, especially through propagation of Buddhism to China and Chinese pilgrims going to India in search of Buddhism. Honestly, I think that it makes, and the Silk Road was a big deal. It ends in China. So I just think that the construction of East-West as the major kind of philosophical fault line is actually an artifact of colonialism, and the construction of the Orient as the thing that can be colonized, and the West as the subject that gets to study it, so that we get fields like Indology, Sinology, Tibetology, where we don't get, Britology and Francology and Germanology, because after all, we're all in the subject position, and the East is in the object position. So I think what we've got is, when you look at colonialism and then its kind of academic arm, which is Orientalism, you get that construction. But you don't want to read back this kind of post-colonial or colonial political construction onto the entire history of human thought and ideas. And I really would like us to stop doing that.
Mm-hmm. So there isn't obviously like an authentic divide, but there does seem to be developed from the Western point of view to abstract things that we can just sort of use. But I mean, that's an interesting question in itself, because you've sort of in part answered it there, but some things happen to what would then be considered in that Eastern abstract, the East, from the Western perspective. I mean, just to give an example, I should be talking to Gregory Shushan about near-death experiences in the future. And one of his big studies is the fact of sort of postmodern Western culture no longer treats these as sincere experiences. They're all sort of socio-cultural, just, artifacts. Oh, this is an interesting thing we can analyze, but it's obviously not a real experience. And do you think the same thing happens from the Western perspective to the East? It becomes almost just like a trinket to analyze, in the sense of, as you say, Tibetology and Egyptology and etc.
Yeah. I think that has happened. And through the construction of academic fields of study in the wake of a kind of colonial and Orientalist project. Right. Mm-hmm. But honestly, it doesn't have any more justification as a way of understanding human history and culture than any other form of racism. We could have, said the same thing, for instance, if we were in Germany and Austria during the 1930s and said, well, isn't it true that we've managed to construct a distinction between Aryan races and other races? Now let's go study them. It would be true that we've constructed that distinction, but it's not true that there's any legitimacy to it. Mm-hmm. And it's not that there are no legitimate distinctions to be drawn in the world. And that's not right. But what it does mean is that if you're going to construct distinctions that are going to have implications for respect, for power relations, for what ideas you take seriously and what ideas you don't take seriously or dismiss out of hand, for who gets to be in subject position, who gets to be in object position, then you'd better be able to justify those. You'd be able to justify them really hard. And simply saying, well, gee, we constructed anthropology and the history of world religions and all of these things in the wake of colonialism, and so we'd already decided to partition the world this way. That just reflects a historical circumstance, not a justification.
So do you think that in the distinction, in that remove from subject and object, do you think that for many Westerners there is perhaps an unconscious inherent superiority? Absolutely.
I don't think there's any question about that. I think there's no question that has infected academia in extraordinary ways. The taking of, for instance, the Semitic or Abrahamic religions as the default position for defining what a religion is, and then wondering whether religions of Asia count in that sense, or thinking about philosophy as something which got to somehow trace its roots to Plato and Aristotle, and dismissing other systems because they don't. And as I said, just the fields of study as they're defined. I mean, the fact that there still are, fields of sinology, Tibetology, Indology, and so forth, but nobody's ever had a field of Britology, or Scotology, or Francology, or Italiology. And people would be kind of offended by that. And if somebody were to see that, for instance, scholars in China or India were studying Britology or had institutes of Francology, there would be this first response: what right do they have to do that? Who are they to study us? And I just know that would be the response, right? And that's just wrong. That's just wrong. And it really is an artifact of a colonial project.
So why do you think it is then that from this position in the West we don't take the East sincerely? It is just this. Do you think there's actually something in? Once again, I'm sort of doing the Western thing and encapsulating all so-called quote unquote Eastern philosophy into a single thing. So I do.
Don't do that. Don't do that.
No, it's tough. But okay, let's take, as we're talking about this book, let's take Buddhism. Do you think there's something inherent within Buddhism which, brings about that superiority? I give the example here of suffering. In the West, we're very, we don't want to deal with suffering in the same way that Buddhism do. That Buddhists do? Do you think that there is something in the philosophy, let's just take Buddhism as the example, which brings about that remove? Or do you think the remove is just something we want to do as a power, a Western power play?
So that's a really good example. Notice that the Stoics thought a lot about suffering and pain, and saw philosophical practice as imbricated with meditative practice and religious practice, and directed to the alleviation of suffering. The Epicureans did the same thing. Now, nobody says, oh, gee, Seneca and Epicurus, these guys weren't, or Marcus Aurelius, these guys weren't really philosophers. We shouldn't study them. No, they're studied when we study ancient medieval Western philosophy, which we typically call, by the way, ancient medieval philosophy, not ancient medieval Western philosophy. Remember that too, that unmarked case that is really prejudicial. So it's nothing about Buddhism per se, I think. Buddhists deny that there's a self. Well, gee, does that make them really weird? Well, Hume did too, but we don't cast him out of the canon for that. I don't think that it has anything to do with content. And one of the ways of knowing that is because most of the people who dismiss Buddhist philosophy as philosophy don't know jack shit about the content. And I mean that. It's quite easy to find people who will say, well, gee, no, I don't do religion. I do philosophy. Buddhism, that's religion. And you want to say, how do you know that? What text have you been reading? I don't need to read it because it's religion, right? You get this, deep circularity going. I really believe that it is because when the West first encountered Buddhism in recent history, say, from the 16th, 17th century on, it encountered it as part of the imperialist and colonialist project. So it was something to be studied, something to be exploited in some way, but not something that was to be taken seriously. So you get, terrific philological and historical work being done by the Bengal Society and the British Oriental Society, by the Polytext Society, all of these people who were studying Buddhism. But they were very much studying it as a kind of curatorial exercise and an academic exercise. Something for us to study. It wasn't, gee, let's consider this against the Anglican Church.
What about figures such as, the classic example is Alan Watts. Do you think that there's perhaps been some damage done there in that westernization of Buddhism?
No, I just think there's evolution. Buddhism, remember, if we're going now to Buddhism specifically and its engagement with the West, which is a big issue, it's really important to remember And we are shifting gears now when you do that. So this is a slight topic change. So I'm going to change register a little bit. Buddhism has always been a missionary religion, a missionary civilization. People forget that because people don't like missionaries. And they do like Buddhism, so they decide Buddhism can't be possibly
How would you define missionary?
People who travel from place to place trying to convert other people to their views.
Okay.
Yeah. So Buddhists did that they went from India to Sri Lanka. They went through Southeast Asia. They went into China. And now they've come into the West, right? They went into Tibet. So now, and so now what we see is the kind of dissemination of Buddhism to the West in the last 100 years or so. And it's a fascinating and rapid and complex dissemination. Every place that Buddhism went, Buddhism transformed. And every place that Buddhism went, Buddhism was transformed by that place.
Okay.
So when you look at the shape that Buddhism takes, things that are taken seriously, and I mean just in religious practice, but also philosophically, in China, they reflect a Chinese context. In Japan, they reflect a Japanese context. Mm-hmm. In Sri Lanka, they reflect a Sinhala context, and so forth. And so as Buddhism is moving to the West, Buddhism will and has been transforming Western cultures in interesting ways, but it also will be transformed and is being transformed by them. And, you know, if people have this kind of romantic nostalgia for a classical pure Buddhism, that's fantasy land, right? That's like that would be like a romantic nostalgia for real British culture. And you want to say, does that mean Saxon? Does that mean Pict? Does that mean Norse? I mean, what does that actually mean, right? Mm-hmm. Because British culture has evolved enormously over time, and one expects it to, right? Mm-hmm. And, you know, you want to sort of get rid of the Anglican Church because real British culture is actually Norman Catholic. Mm. I mean, really, and with Buddhism, we have the same phenomenon. So I really don't have much sympathy with people who say, oh, no, this is just westernized Buddhism. When they look at modern contemporary Western Buddhism, that's no different that's just Chinese Buddhism, or that's just Indian Buddhism, or that's just Pali Buddhism, right? Buddhism has always been a constantly changing thing. And you expect that if you're a Buddhist, because one of the central tenets of every Buddhist tradition is that all phenomena are impermanent, constantly changing. Buddhism's no different.
Mm-hmm. Does the impermanence and constantly changing elements of Buddhist philosophy differ from, let's say, Heraclitus and Lucretius?
Lots of people have noticed similarities between Heraclitus and Lucretius and Buddhism on the idea of impermanence. And I think those are very, very similar ideas. And you see the same stuff happening a little bit later in the West in Epicurus and Marcus Aurelius, right? Mm-hmm. Once you get Epicurean philosophy and atomism and constant change, you get the same kind of emphasis on the transitory. As you get in Hume.
I feel like Hume is he your sort of constant go-to?
I enjoy Hume's philosophy a lot. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I just want to, for me, it's important to point out that when we look at classical interactions across cultures, one of the important ones is the interaction of Madhyamaka Buddhism and skepticism. And that's pretty well documented stuff. I mean, even the Greeks were aware of that. So when we look at Diogenes Laertius' biography of Pyrrho, he talks about him going to India with Alexander and debating with these gymnosophists, right? And coming back saying these very particular things, which are all quotes from Buddhist scriptures. And we know that Buddhists and Greeks were meeting in Persia, in the Persian court, which was a big, cosmopolitan meeting place during that time. And so when we look at contemporary Buddhists who are the heirs to classical Madhyamaka, and we look at modern European and contemporary European philosophers who are heirs to the Pyrrhonian skeptics, we see that they're drinking from the same well. Mm-hmm. And it's a very ancient well.
There's still a lot of questions flowing about for me, but I'm trying not to jump around too much. But just to jump back a little bit in terms of the initial study of Buddhism in the quote unquote West again. Yeah. The figures who, the few figures who did take Eastern philosophy more seriously seem to have been cast aside in the academy, probably for these reasons. I mean, Schopenhauer is the sort of very common example of.
Yeah.
There's also people such as René Guénon and the traditionalists who are highly influenced from individual Eastern culture. Once again, apologize for using just Eastern, but ease of use. Do you think that they are ignored for this reason?
Yeah, it's the phrase, of course, is going native, and that you can't say that in a non-pejorative way, right? And I think that the moment people do that, they're in trouble. Now, let me talk first person on that. Because a lot of my, the early part of my career is just simply in foundations of cognitive science, philosophy of mind, and logic in a purely Western register, because that's what I was trained to do. And when I started working on Buddhist philosophy and publishing things that cited Buddhist philosophers, people said, so have you just quit philosophy and gone into religious studies? And that's quite common. Or one philosopher, Jerry Fodor, I was a colleague and friend, and I wrote a paper critical of a piece of his where I cited Nagarjuna and used a Nagarjunian argument against him. And he wrote back to me and said, if you have to go all the way to Tibet to win the argument, to argue with me, I win. And that was the end of it, right? I mean, since the argument drew from something Asian, it didn't count.
Okay.
So, yeah, I think that one of the ways that philosophical racism rears its ugly head is in dismissing people who pay attention to Asian philosophy. Now, that's not happening so much anymore. But I think that's only a phenomenon of the last couple of decades as a result of a lot of hard work by a lot of people pushing this stuff in people's faces. But even if you look at the reactions to Brian's and my New York Times piece, you see that there was a lot of serious angry racism directed at us then. And I just think that's a huge part of the Western Academy. And it's always been. And that's part of what we're trying to batter down when we're kind of trying to push more Asian philosophy into the curriculum and into people's research and into just the definition of philosophy and into the programs of international philosophical organizations. We're fighting against a deeply ingrained racism that says that if you do this, think about it this way. If you've got a philosophy department in almost any university in the country, or in our country, in your country, same thing. But the odds are very strong that everybody in that department does Western philosophy of one kind or another. Very, very strong. There are a few places where that's not true, but very, very few. All right. So imagine somebody in a department like that saying, yes, we know that it's important to do, Indian philosophy and Chinese philosophy, African philosophy, Native American philosophy, you name it. But we don't have anybody here who knows anything about it, so we can't do it, right? And so then what happens? Their Kant specialist dies or takes a job someplace else. And so now they've got a department with 17 Western philosophers and one vacancy. What are they going to advertise? A new position in Kant. We need the Kant scholar, right? That's really important. We don't need any of the philosophical traditions of China, India, Japan, Korea, Africa, North America. But we need to make sure we've got somebody who does Kant, somebody who does Leibniz, somebody who does Locke, somebody who does Heidegger, somebody who does Merleau-Ponty. We need to make sure that everybody who was white is covered. And almost all of them are boys, by the way. But we need to make sure of that, but we can ignore the rest of the world. Now, I'm sorry. There's simply no way to look at that and not say that that's a reflection of a very deeply ingrained racism.
But what's strange is even the postmodernists and post-structuralists who sought to critique much of this and decolonize theory have still ended up in that on top of that same pedestal. Foucault, Derrida. So exactly. How has that happened?
Yeah, well, that's happened because a whole lot of those people, are basically drinking the same European racist Kool-Aid that the people they're critiquing are. So I don't think that I also don't like the analytic continental divide. I think that's as much bullshit as any of this. But people who like to read phenomenology versus people who like to read positivism are still coming out of the same broad cultural milieu that says that the question is, which Europeans do we read? I don't know. That's kind of boring to me. It's high time to be asking, if I've got a philosophy department, why does it look like a department of Western philosophy? I just think that's just deeply, deeply, deeply problematic. Now, as I say, it's changing, but it's changing, slowly. And there are very few departments. So people point to a department and say, look, we now have a position in Indian philosophy. We've got 17 positions in white studies. And we've got 1 position in Indian philosophy. Aren't we cool? And I want to say, yeah, you're a lot cooler than the people who've got 18 positions in white studies. But again, I want to say, where's the balance here, right? And there are very few departments who are willing to say, you know what, we need to have as much attention to Chinese philosophy as we do to European philosophy, as much attention to Indian philosophy as we do, and attention to African philosophy too. You just don't see that happening yet. It will, but there are very few departments that have more than one. So they say, oh, we've got all this stuff, and she does Asian philosophy. All of it. I mean, nobody wants to say, oh, yeah, we've got a fabulous department. We've got a Zhuangzi specialist. We've got a Laozi specialist. We've got a Kongzi specialist, a Mengzi specialist. And we've also got, he does all European philosophy. People wouldn't look at that as a philosophy department, would they? They'd look at that as a Chinese studies department with somebody who does, with a philosopher who's somehow been stuck in there, right? And that's the way I think of most departments of European philosophy. They're departments of philosophical white studies with one guy who does everything else. And that's just as crazy, right? Think about looking at that in the mirror image and how bizarre it looks. That's where we are. Honestly, that's where we are.
Okay. Just before we move into sort of perhaps how to change these things, how these things can be taught, and we can alter what's been happening in history. I don't always think it's best to try find someone to blame, but do you think there are key philosophical figures in the history of philosophy who have propagated this view more than others, who we can look at and say there's, something arose from them which really spread itself into the study of philosophy?
No, on the one hand, there are too many, and the other hand, so nobody stands out, right? I think that the people who you might want to really blame, right? So you might say, oh, well, look at Kant. He said that black people can't think. Look at Hegel, who said that Asia stands outside of history, right? Look at Hume, who, has his own racist views. Look at, Heidegger, who was an anti-Semite. Right? Look at, you can do this, right? But they're not the causes. They're the effects, right? And, it's like in America, people have been asking this question, did Trump cause all this trouble that we're in right now? And you want to say, no, he's an effect. He's just the most prominent effect, not the cause, right? So I think that basically we've got culture that's been hermetically enough sealed intellectually, if not commercially, that it's allowed people to think of the world as basically having a center pole, and that's somewhere in Europe, and everything else is peripheral. And that's just a kind of European disease. I think that philosophy just partakes of that European disease.
So how can this be undone?
It can be undone by relentless teaching and propaganda, and it's got to be relentless. One of the great things about this is that the humanities are under enough threat and sometimes disastrous demolition at universities around the world that they need badly to put students in classrooms because it's only enrollments that people listen to, right? And it turns out that if you look at the classes that enroll lots and lots of undergraduates, they tend to be classes in Asian philosophy, for better or worse. students flock to those. They think it's pretty cool. And so some departments are beginning to see their survival as depending on pandering to the needs of foolish undergraduates.
Pandering.
And
pandering to the East.
Exactly. And I think that pandering will save us.
Okay. Okay. Let me play devil's advocate for a second, and try not come across as a massive racist. Do you think there is a place for sort of culturally contextual focusing? So if you are from England, you study more of British philosophy for the fact you're from there, or no? Okay.
That I don't. I don't. I'll tell you what I do think makes sense, and I'll tell you what I think doesn't make sense.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
What does make sense is teaching philosophy and ideas in its cultural context. So to understand Kant in the context of Friedrich's Prussia, it makes sense to try to understand Rousseau in the context of the ferments in Switzerland and France to which he was responding. Mm-hmm. It makes sense to think about Locke in terms of the Reformation. It makes sense to think about Chandrakirti in the context of medieval Indian Buddhism, right? So I don't believe you want to just decontextualize people and see them as kind of abstract ideas that came from, Athena somehow directly into people's heads. And that kind of context is really important. And that means that you really want to know the stuff that you're teaching and the culture before you're teaching it. I don't think we do enough of that in general in philosophy. We kind of put people in dialogue with each other without noticing the differences in the context in which they're functioning. So to take a kind of random example, people who want to say, oh, we just teach Kant and Rawls together and Habermas because they're all doing basically the same thing. I want to say, now, wait a minute. There's a really big difference between 20th century North America and 18th century Russia.
That's a continental trait, though, isn't it? The sort of emphasis on biography. Not everyone would.
That's right.
Russell and Wittgenstein wouldn't take that seriously at all.
Exactly, and I think that one has to. Okay. I think that one has to. So I think that's important. On the other hand, the idea that we should each study specially the culture in which we were born, I think in the world that we inhabit right now, that's dangerous because it does at least two things that are bad, maybe more. One is that it normalizes our culture and alienizes other cultures in a way that leads people to think that where I live is regular and everything else is some kind of a deviation from that. And that takes us from cosmopolitanism into tolerance, which is a really bad idea, right? Where we say, gee, I know these people are different and I know they really are weird, but I'll tolerate them because I think diversity is important. But there shouldn't only be normal people. There should also be weird people, and I want to enjoy their weirdness and their exoticism.
But then, if you had that, there wouldn't be normal and weird.
Exactly right. So that's one problem, right? Is that you tend to get this kind of center pole vision of your own culture. The other is that you end up thinking of your culture as siloed and isolated and not understanding the fact that it only exists as a culture in a constant open interchange with other cultures. Mm-hmm. So to take, the example of, British culture, for instance, to try to understand what it is to be English without understanding the empire, without understanding the interactions that England has had with all of the cultures with which it's come into colonial contact or conflictual contact. It just doesn't even make any sense, right? And so you get this kind of fantasy of purity that obscures not only the cultures you ignore, but also obscures the nature of your home culture. So I'm really against that kind of nationalistic education. It strikes me as, I hear patriotic education in China. When I hear that, I hear, National Socialist curriculum in Germany. When I hear that, And I think it's a terrible thing.
So what would your ideal sort of undergraduate course, how would it be structured?
Well, I actually had the good fortune of being in the founding faculty of Yale and US College in Singapore. And I think we nailed that one just right. So we had a required core curriculum that was totally globalized. And the philosophy curriculum began in classical China, moved to classical Greece, and then into classical India, then came into modern Islamic period and modern Europe, but then back into modern China and modern India, so that we neither began nor ended in Europe. And we made sure that we were not simply teaching the past of Asia and the present of Europe, but we were teaching the past and present of a number of different cultures in dialogue with one another. And I think that's the way you want a curriculum in the humanities to look. You really want it to be absolutely explicitly global, so that students never have a sense that there's a center and a periphery. We live on a globe, and there really isn't the center of the surface of a globe.
We didn't really get into the heart of Buddhist ideas, but I think we it was a pretty good conversation in terms of East-West divide. I mean, is there anything you'd like to add that you feel we've overlooked in terms of that conversation?
No, I think we've done a pretty good job. I mean, I know that I'm pushing a propagandistic line, but I feel like we're in a.
In what sense do you see it as a propagandistic line?
Well, in the good old-fashioned sense of propaganda, right? This is information meant to change people's views.
Okay.
And I think that we really need to hold people to be able to look in the mirror and to ask, is the intellectual program in which I'm engaged, is the way that I'm teaching my students, is the curriculum I've chosen to study if I'm a student, one that's genuinely reflective of the intellectual traditions of humanity? Or is it a narrowly parochial curriculum that is only succeeding in reinforcing pernicious prejudices?
Okay, well that's a question I would ask. You said that you had that experience of being trained in Western philosophy in the continental tradition, and then came across Eastern, quote unquote, Eastern philosophy, and realized there's this whole other world of philosophy out there. Is there any text you can think of for those people who feel they're steeped in Western philosophy, who, are not so much a beginner's text, but text that might make you realize just how much you are being suffocated by Western philosophy?
Quite a few. I mean, if you want just a history of world philosophy, Ben-Ami Sharfstein's History of World Philosophy is a fabulous place to go. Or this great series of internet lectures, right? A History of Philosophy Without Gaps, that is just absolutely fabulous. Any of these great new Oxford and Blackwell handbooks of world philosophy and of philosophy in other cultures, Japanese philosophy, Indian philosophy, and so forth, that are simply terrific. I would say that if you wake up and you say to yourself, damn, I just noticed that all of the philosophers I've ever read kind of look just like me, then it's time to stop reading them for a while and say, for a while, I'm only going to read people from really different cultures. And it's not hard to find that stuff. Mm-hmm. It isn't. There's lots of good material in translation from all of the world's philosophical traditions. Not everything's available, but a lot. Certainly a lot more than was when I got started. And good, reliable translations. So just as people are accustomed to reading Kant or Hegel or Aristotle or Plato in English and don't feel that's terrible, you can be reading Indian philosophy in English. You can be reading African philosophy in English. There's plenty of good material to read.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Are you currently working on any texts at the moment?
I am. I'm working on a couple of fun projects. Somebody who I've been studying for a while with my colleague Nalini Bhushan is the early 20th century Indian philosopher Krishna Chandra Bhattacharya. And we're writing a book on his text called Subject is Freedom. Mm-hmm. Which is a fascinating intercultural document on its own. Bhattacharya was deeply influenced by Kant and Husserl, but also by Vedanta, Indian Vedanta and Nyaya, that's really fusing classical Indian and recent European philosophy in very creative ways. I'm working on, not surprisingly, a book on Chandrakirti, looking at his introduction to the Middle Way and all of its commentaries and trying to write a contemporary commentary on that text. And I'm also working on a book on the concept of normativity, called Nature and Norms, and talking about how to naturalize normativity. And that's kind of a weird sequel to my Hume book, but it's not about Hume. It's a Humean reply to all of the contemporary Kantians who think that we have to talk about normativity in a transcendent vein and talk about how we can talk about it in the naturalistic vein. And that will be a very cross-cultural book.
Okay.
So those are my big projects right now.
Yeah, three huge projects. When are these to be released already, or is that
none of these will be around for a few years. They're all just getting started. Okay. The things that are coming out soon, I have a book on Buddhist ethics coming out this fall, a big book on Tibetan epistemological debates with a whole bunch of colleagues coming out this fall, actually a 2-volume set. Okay. And then a book on why we don't have selves. That's a very cross-cultural book. You can guess who the two heroes are. That's coming out in February. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Unless there's anything you'd like to add, I think that's a good place to finish up.
That's really cool. Thank you so much for having me.
Jay Garfield, thanks very much. Yeah, thank you.